All set?
Yeah.
Cool.
I'm recording right now.
So today we're talking about democracy and or welfare and or both, right? I mean, do you have any strong points in favor? Just in the preamble there, you were saying that you feel that democracy and welfare are quite related. How do you see them as being related?
Well, I think that the justification for one is like almost one and the same with the justification for the other. So like if you have one, like if you have like a state uh with democracy presumably, but it could just be really any state, uh arguments against welfare are going to be pretty hard to come by, right? Because if you have some state, you probably have some justification for collecting taxes, and if you have some type of justification to collect taxes, then uh, it would kind of be odd to say, well, I'm going to tell the state what it can and can't spend those taxes on, right?
So, would you say that arguments against welfare are arguments against all statism or specifically democracy?
Well, I don't think, I mean, you can argue against welfare and not argue against the state. So, I mean, I don't really think so.
All right. What would you say is the strongest justification that you know of for either democracy or welfare?
Well, I think that there's a lot of empirical evidence that democracy has good outcomes. So, for example, Rummel 1995 implies that democracies are less likely to kill their own populace. And Acemoglu 2018 implies that democracies increase economic growth. And I think that both of those are positive things. But on a purely theoretical level, democracies offer forms of government, a structure which, in the very least, in its worst possible, case scenario, only like commits wrong actions or goes against the will of the minority, right? And so if we have a lot of popular, ethical views would, value that type of thing.
I mean, so you said there that democracies increase economic growth. Is democracy instead of some other system, and you'd expect democracy to do better than that other system, or democracy over, anarchy?
Well, I mean, if it's an empirical study, so it's only going to be done like with already existing structures. So obviously, if we're asking the question compared to an anarchist system, we don't know. But compared to all hitherto existing systems, it seems pretty clear that democracies have this effect, at least from an empirical point of view.
Well, I would say that we absolutely do know a priori that democracy would not be, have greater wealth or anything like that as compared to anarchy. Because a democracy, as you said, it's going to have some sort of taxation. And, we can ask the question, where do these taxes come from? They don't just pop out of thin air. Well, the only three ways that you could possibly get a taxable asset is either you homestead it, so you take it from nature, maybe you produce some things that you already have into something new, that's a way you could get a taxable asset, or you could trade it with someone else. So a tax is going to imply a disincentive towards homesteading, production, and trade. It's precisely homesteading, production, and trade, which is how you get more wealth. That's how you increase your welfare.
Well, that's purely theoretical, and I made myself very clear I was speaking on empirical evidence. I wasn't making a theoretical case. But if we wanna talk about that on a theoretical level, I feel like it's quite hasty to dismiss the wealth collected by the state and the role of the state in production altogether. I feel like that's I mean, you're kind of like dismissing an entire factor of the economy. So I don't really
Well,
know if that's all too convincing to me.
well, any sort of production that the state's involved in is necessarily going to be, it's going to be means allocated where people don't want them to be, right? Or else they wouldn't have to tax you. If you were already wanting to do these projects that the state want to do, they wouldn't have to force you into it. So they're necessarily going to be misallocating scarce means, right? Which sounds
Well, I mean, that's not
anti-productive.
necessarily true. I mean, the state is just an institution. One of the things it does is it forces people to do things, but it also can engage in the economy like any other association can, right?
But if means were already going to be allocated in that way, then the state wouldn't need to force people to do it. They wouldn't need to tax you for it, right? So the fact that they're taxing you means that there's going to be a misallocation of those resources, i.e., they're being allocated towards lines of production which people value less than what they were going to put them into.
Yeah, but I'm not sure what any of that has to do with increased production. I mean, what people value in a myopic, individualistic sense is not necessarily what's going to be best for a society overall in terms of production. That seems trivially true.
Well, what people value, the reason why that's relevant is because the question is whether or not democracies increase wealth in society, welfare, something like that, right? But they don't. And welfare in the Austrian sense, not in the give poor people money or whatever. So I'll stay away from that term for now. So I'll just say wealth, right? If the question is whether democracies increase wealth, well, they don't because they're misallocating these means. So they are producing things which people value less than what would have been produced. So if you have something which you value less, then so if I value B less than A and I'm getting B instead of A, I'm not as wealthy as I would have been if I got A.
Yeah, I don't really see how that is necessarily the case when we're looking at it from a macro point of view, because an economy is necessarily going to have lots of different sectors, lots of different areas that aren't necessarily um, interfacing with each other. And if we have a large meta system like a state, that state can serve as a sort of mediation between all of these areas of the economy, all these physical locations, and it can, through collecting taxes from the populace, choose to invest in certain communities that wouldn't otherwise get that wealth or that capital or what have you uh, in a sort of free market society without the state, just simply because they wouldn't be in contact with the actors who would be able to supply them with that.
Right, so yeah, they will invest in some areas which otherwise wouldn't have got that investment, but that's my exact point. That is malinvestment. They're investing incorrectly there.
No, but that's not malinvestment. It would have happened, but it didn't because the, sort of
Well, you said it wouldn't have
inputs
happened
were not there.
otherwise. Right, you said if
Yeah,
without state interference, this investment would have
without
happened.
a mediating actor which connects
Well, an
both areas.
aggressive actor, right? So this isn't, you're painting it like they're just some nice, friendly arbitrageur, right? But they're not. They're
I'm
not
not
just
making a moral claim about the state.
right. But
I'm just saying that
they're
the
not
state can
engaged in
solve the problem.
arbitrage. Is the point? They
They
aren't.
can.
No, that's not what the state is doing. They are reallocating resources away from where people want them to be to where they don't want them to be. This isn't what an arbitrageur does. An arbitrageur is necessarily people want to give him their stuff, so they are wanting to invest in this guy, and then he is
I
doing it
see.
somewhere else, right?
Yeah, I'm sorry. When I say like a mediating force, I'm not talking about like some type of, anarchists talk about private arbitration and that type of thing. I'm just talking about like a connecting thing, something that connects two disparate areas or entities, what have you, right? And so, insofar as the state can do this, it can facilitate a sort of economic relationship where funds are going to areas, invested in areas, so that production can be built up in those areas. And that wouldn't have been the case without that mediating force,
Right, but
that
I
state
completely
apparatus.
agree that some people will be enriched by the presence of the state, namely the state will be enriched probably. But that's that's neither here nor there, because they're being enriched at the expense of everyone else. So you have, in general, wealth will fall. But some people will benefit. Some people will get more wealthy when you have this aggression. But in general, those people who are, not in the state's back pocket, they're not being enriched.
Yeah, but I guess my point is that because the state is unique in this aspect, I am not willing to draw the inference that without the state there would be there would just necessarily be greater wealth, right? Because the state has this unique attribute, I think that we can't just sort of like hastily, not hastily, I don't know, I'm saying weird stuff, hastily say that, it's going to be less because of this theoretical analysis. The theoretical analysis has no basis in empirical, study or what have you.
Well, I mean, theoretical analysis is, antecedent to any sort of empirical study. Empirical study can't tell you anything about economic theory. Economic theory is what's going to tell us about economics here. But I mean,
yeah, that's one view,
and it's the correct view. But you're saying there that the
sure.
state was unique in this aspect of connecting people, but they're absolutely not. That is the role of arbitrage within the market. So basically, what the arbitrageur does is he will say, "Hey, there's market over here, market A, and then there's market B. Market A is, they're selling rice at such a price that the arbitrageur knows that he could make a profit by transporting rice from A to B and then reselling it at B. So he's buying this rice not because he wants to eat a rice dinner, but because he wants to sell it on for a profit. This is arbitrage, where you buy, either at one point in time and resell later, hoping to resell for a greater profit, right? Or you buy in one area and sell in another area. That is arbitrage, and it's a very important feature of the market, right? This is what drives equilibration, by and large, or at least it helps equilibration.
Yeah, I'm not saying that that's not something that can exist in a free market system.
But you said the state was unique in that aspect, though.
Yes, the state is unique that it can draw the funds of the entire populace and move that towards different areas.
This is a bad thing.
Yeah, I know you're saying that it's bad. I'm not making like a moral claim. I'm just, it's a descriptive claim about whether or not the society will in the end have a greater productive capacity or produce more things, right? Because the state has this unique aspect, right? I mean, like, it's kind of like the type of thought experiment of we can have either a moral society, moral, maybe taking your view or taking my view or whoever's view, or we can have a society directed towards some other end. And the end in question here is production, right? Like, we can easily imagine a society which disregards consent, disregards all moral concerns, and maximizes just raw production. We wouldn't want to live in that world, but it certainly would be the case. And so, given that we can easily imagine that, why is it too hard to accept that, just because the state is violating consent in some way, this would result in necessarily a reduction in production or something like that?
Well, let's attack that there. The problem with these, I want to have a wealthy society over a moral society, is that you're actually sneaking some moral proposition in there, or like when it's an argument for some system, i.e., why we should choose this system over other systems. Note the should there, right? It's you're sneaking an ethic through the sally port. Right, I'm willing to explicitly state my ethic. So, what's your ethic?
Yeah, well, my ethic. Well, that's a complicated question, but we're trying to address a descriptive claim right now, and I don't really want to go into the moral claim in question when we still have a disagreement on a descriptive matter, right? That would seem like we're kind of bouncing around a lot, right?
Well, I don't think it is bouncing around, because the root of it was me asking you for a good argument in favor of either democracy or welfare. You went for democracy, and your argument in favor of why we should pick a democracy was that democracies are less likely to kill their own populace, and that they increase economic growth. I
Yeah, but
attacked the latter part of that.
if I'm saying that descriptively, democracies increase economic growth and production, and you fall back with the fact that you disagree with my conclusion that therefore we should support democracy, right? You're kind of dismissing the claim, right? Well, maybe you disagree with it.
Well, I'm attacking the root of the claim, right? Because otherwise you're just gonna... Because I doubt we're going to end up... Because I feel like I've already demonstrated the objective case as to why democracy is a destruction of wealth. And you've just gone, well, you know, I prefer empirical stuff, because I'm discussing it empirically. But, okay, right, go ahead and discuss it empirically all you want, but ultimately the root of the argument is, why should we choose democracy over anarchy? Why should we do it?
Yeah, and I understand. Like, it's not going to speak to you at all, because you're going to view any type of democracy as immoral because it's a state, right? Like,
Yep.
I mean, I'm under no delusion there, and probably most of your audience is along the same lines as you, right? But to any passerby, it would be relevant moral information, the fact as to whether or not democracies reduce the killing of their own populaces, or whether or not democracies increase economic growth. These are going to be morally relevant for them. Would you not agree?
It's not morally relevant unless you can actually demonstrate that, hey, we should achieve these goals. This is something that we should go for. This is our ethic here. So you need to be explicit in your ethic, and then we can start seeing, okay, right, our ethic is we want more widgets, right? And democracy, they're really good at making more widgets. We're trying to maximize widget production. It's kind of pointless fighting up here on whether democracy does indeed maximize widget production, when we can just go, okay, right, is that actually a correct ethic, that we ought to maximize widget production?
Okay, I see what you're saying. We're going to have the moral conversation then, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that being the case, I have to support democracy because it is the best of all possible alternative systems. And specifically, I understand that you espouse a type of anarcho-capitalism, and why I think that system would be less favorable than a democratic system, for example, is the fact that I think, number one, the system that you espouse is contradictory to itself. It produces results which are contradictory to the reasons for instantiating it. And also, even if it did not do that, the results that it did instantiate would be fundamentally immoral even more so than democracy, because they would privilege a minority in the use of force, in the establishment of norms in that society, right? And so I can demonstrate this, I think. So on point one, my point that anarcho-capitalism produces results which are contrary to the reasons for its establishment. Anarcho-capitalism instantiates legal and social norms using private arbitration, and it must assume, in order to escape violence in matters of arbitration, rational self-interest and the bargaining mechanism. In so doing, it then privileges wealth in the establishment of laws and norms. This is plutarchy. There is no reason, I should say, it's irrational to assume, it's an irrational inference to assume that plutarchy would abide by the non-aggression principle, thereby, anarcho-capitalism is paradoxical unto itself because it instantiates a system which it is irrational to believe will abide by its purported reasoning for instantiating it. Furthermore, plutarchy is in of itself unfavorable to democratic systems of government because democratic systems of government privilege the majority will, and plutarchy necessarily privileges a minority will.
Was that last point for point 2, or do we want to just go over point 1 for now?
Yeah, the last point was point 2. Sorry, I went off into that.
All right. So for point 1, what you've done here is you've misunderstood ancap law, right? We're not saying that the law is decided by this arbitration. Rather, we are globalists in terms of law, or rather universalists. We think law is discoverable a priori. Wherever we could objectively say whether or not a given decision by an arbitrator was correct or incorrect, right? So this is actually a common objectivist misunderstanding, where it's a bunch of different legal systems being created by people. That's not the case. We have an objective standard for legality, and it's just that this standard implies that the state is unjust. They are not allowed to monopolize arbitration or things like that. Right? This is what anarcho-capitalism is. We aren't specifically saying, hey, we want this system where we've got our rights enforcement agencies and all this lovely stuff. We're not saying we want that specifically. We're saying, hey, this system is unjust. That system is also unjust. This system over here is unjust. These are all unjust. You're not allowed to do these aggressive actions. And then we're sort of wagering. We're saying, right, I reckon there'll probably be some sort of insurance set up for people to protect their rights, something like that, because we're Austrians, we like to predict about what might happen in a free market. Of course we could be wrong, but that's basically theorizing about what the market will roughly look like. We're not saying we want a specific market structure. We're not saying we want, say, firms or co-ops or anything like that. We're saying, hey, we reckon it'll probably end up this way. And yeah.
Yeah, but I guess maybe I'll just say to that, I think that if a set of norms or a set of values or a set of any beliefs that any person has, if instantiated, brings about its own negation, I think that is paradoxical, right? So it's all well and good to say that, oh, well, we have this view and we don't know what the world will look like if we abided by this view. Or this law, so on and so forth. Okay, fine, right? But if that negates itself, then it's paradoxical, no?
Would you accept the norm that rape is bad?
Certainly.
All right, so
I mean, in the sense that I say things are bad, yes.
So if we were to instantiate this norm, I don't know what that exactly I mean, but we're just going around saying, hey guys, rape is not a good thing. And then someone says, oh yeah, and then they rape someone. It's like, seems your norm has just instantiated its own negation, right? Because people didn't all follow your norm. It's like, well, yeah, of course. Like there would be no point for us to concern ourselves with the law if nobody was ever a criminal. The entire point is that you are indeed physically capable of breaking a norm, right? That doesn't change its truth at all.
Yes, but if I were making a claim that rape is wrong and there ought be like, and I'm making this claim with the meaning that I'm expressing being that there should be there will be, so to speak, no rape, right? And we have failed insofar as there is even some rape. Well, clearly that's always going to be contradicted. But if by rape is wrong, I'm just saying we should seek to end rape, or we should seek to reduce rape insofar as we can. Well, then I think that this type of statement is not paradoxical insofar as it is rational to infer that it could be instantiated without creating its own negation, right?
I,
Right. So the difference between this claim and the claims that I think you're making is that it is rational to infer that it would be able to be instantiated without its own negation, and it is irrational to infer that the things that you are espousing can be instantiated without begetting their own negation.
I don't think there's a single ancap on planet Earth who's ever existed who thinks that, you know, some wizard's going to come along and run his magic wand, and then suddenly there will never be ever any aggression ever again. Right? We recognize that aggression is a possibility, just as it's certainly possible that there will be rape in the future. I would say even likely. I reckon that there probably is rape going on right now. But that doesn't mean that suddenly, well, it's negated our ethic here. No, 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 no. It's still the case that nobody should ever aggress. That is anarcho-capitalism, saying nobody should ever aggress.
It's perhaps the case that I'm just misunderstanding you, but I don't think that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying that your claim is analogous to the person who's saying there will never be any rape, right? I'm saying that specifically your claim suffers from the same problem that claim has, insofar as it is irrational to assume that it will not bring about its own negation, right? Not that it is as absurd as that claim, or that it's, you know, expecting some magic wand to be, cast away all coercion or all conflict or something like that, right? Like, there's a point at which if someone says, like, say for example, we ought to oppose rape, we ought to reduce rape, but then they advocate for a system, but in saying that, right, in saying that we ought to not rape, actually that brings about more rape. That's more of like what I'm talking about, right?
Wait. So in advocating a system where there isn't rape, you bring about more rape?
Yeah, if that is the case, if that happens, I think that
well,
that would
simply
be
advocating,
an example of something.
Simply advocating that, saying, hey, people shouldn't go around raping, that doesn't imply that there will be rapes. And similarly, just saying,
it's a hypothetical. It's a hypothetical statement.
Right, but then if it's analogous, right? If it's an analogy, then it would also be the case that simply advocating that non-aggression doesn't imply that there will be aggression, unless it's disanalogous, in which case you've stated a disanalogy.
No, I'm saying that it is analogous in that respect. I think you're mistaken.
Right,
I
so
think that
simply advocating non-aggression
without
doesn't imply
yes, it brings
aggression.
about aggression.
How does it bring about aggression? How?
Because if there's no aggression, then presumably, like, I'm working within the framework proposed by ancaps, right? And in that understanding, and I want to work within that understanding because it's what you espouse, right? So in that understanding, there is something known as the bargaining mechanism and the assumption of rational self-interest. If we take these both at face value, it produces a society which is plutarchy, which is ruled by wealth, ruled by market forces, so to speak, or money. And I think that this is fundamentally contrary to the reasoning for why this would be brought about in the first place, which is conflict avoidance, because there's no reason to assume, and it's irrational to assume, that plutarchy would respect the non-aggression principle.
Right. Do you think that ancaps are advocating a specific system, or do you think that we're just advocating non-aggression?
I think that you're advocating non-aggression, and you understand, or you think that that will result in a certain particular society.
Right, but then simply advocating non-aggression, that doesn't imply aggression. Because that was what you had to show, is that simply advocating non-aggression implies that someone's going to aggress.
I can't make that claim. I can't.
Well, that's the claim you have to prove.
You're right.
Yeah.
Well, you're right in that. Okay, I can't make that claim. But using the understanding that most ancaps have about what that world may look like, we can understand that it would be irrational to assume that that world would respect the non-aggression principle. So,
I mean, yeah, someone's probably going to aggress at some point. Like, no ancap disputes that what we think is going to happen is nobody will ever aggress again. we reckon there
Yeah, but
probably
that's
will be
not
some aggression.
okay. I'm not saying that you think there will be, or ANCAPs broadly think there will be no aggression. Obviously, you're not out
You're
here
coming in
saying,
with
"Oh yeah, we're gonna live in."
you're coming in with like, well, this world that you think will happen, or at least you hope would be, better than your current thing. Actually, it wouldn't bring about total non-aggression. It's like, well, of course it fucking wouldn't.
No, it would bring it about at an extent which would be probably like greater than it exists in current society.
Well, then it's preferable. If there's more non-aggression, that's good.
No, I mean aggression. More.
How would there be
aggression.
more aggression?
Because plutarchy is rule by minority, and according to my
Well, we're against
sources,
rule.
rule by minority. I know you're against rule, right?
Right, so
But
we're not
now you're
advocating that
making.
system. We're advocating a system of total non-aggression. That's what we advocate.
I just don't. I don't see how that. I mean, you can advocate that all you want, but
And that's what we're gonna do. That's what ANCAPs
yeah,
will
it would be
continue to do.
great if there were not, aggression or whatever. Even in the sense that you mean aggression, to a certain extent, it would be great if we could eliminate that altogether. But
So we should work towards that, shouldn't we?
yeah, but I guess the question then would be, what should we do to work towards that, right?
I mean, now that you're an avowed
I'm
ANCAP,
laying
I guess
out-
we can discuss theory. Now that you agree with the goal of working towards non-aggression, and that we're both ANCAPs here, I guess we can, talk
Well, I
theory
actually
then.
I don't want to agree with that, right? Like, so my understanding of aggression or coercion or conflict or things like that are going to be different than yours. But I'm just saying that it would be better to eliminate what you mean by coercion, conflict, aggression. Insofar as I understand it, in a lot of instances, it is actually good to eliminate those things,
Well,
right? But my definition of it's going to be different.
In what instances are you against, trying to eliminate aggression? Like, which instances of aggression are good?
Well, I'm gonna disagree with like argumentation ethics and sort of the property rights that you're gonna want to instantiate from like the homesteading principle, and you've laid out the whole thing to me before, so I don't need to go over it. Right? I'm gonna disagree with that, so I'm gonna have a standard that's different there, right? But insofar as I'm against conflict, as I understand it, I'm against it, right? Categorically, almost.
I mean, that's a big almost. Like, I could say, well, I'm almost against rape, and you're gonna raise an eyebrow to that. It's like, what the fuck do you mean almost?
Yes, but that's not what I'm saying, right? I'm saying something much more reasonable. I'm also against rape, right?
Yeah, you're
I'm not
saying
necessarily.
Like, well, I'm almost against aggression. It's like, well, when aren't you against it?
Aggression, as you understand it, and maybe you don't know this, but a lot of people understand conflict and understand aggression and coercion differently than you do. I mean, at this point, you have to know that.
Well, yeah, but other people are wrong about it. They have bad definitions.
I know. Yes, I don't have that level of hubris to say that they're wrong about what I mean by coercion.
Some say hubris, I say looking out on the world and seeing a bunch of fucking brainworms walking about.
Yes. Naturally, you're in a call with one right now.
Am I?
Well, I assume you must think of me that way because I disagree with you on that specific point.
Well, people can disagree with me and still be thinking minds, but most people are not thinking minds. I'll give you an example. Last weekend, I was on the train, and some guy, I was sitting on like a reserved seat. So this old guy with his wife comes up, and they're like, "Hey, are these your seats, bro?" And he was like, "Yeah, those are our seats." But he like walked past further down the aisle. So when I like got out of the seats, him and his wife were just like fucking like, they cordoned me in. So I like stepped back to let him in, and he was like, "Yeah, but let my wife in as well." It's like, yeah, I know that, fucking idiot. You have to get in first because you're blocking the aisle. I can't get out of the way. I can't let you both in identical times. This is an example of a person who doesn't actually think. He didn't think one step ahead. He's just following through the little rhythms. You start looking for these things, and you see it everywhere. Most people do not think. They are just kind of, I call them brainworms. They follow along with whatever the fuck else anybody else is doing.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of people like that, but I'm not necessarily, when I say like, oh, you have to understand that not a lot of people agree with you in that definition of conflict, coercion and whatnot. I'm not just speaking about brainworms. I'm also talking about, people who study politics and philosophy and sociology and these types of things.
Right, but do they study conflict as deeply as the people who built their philosophy around conflict? I doubt
maybe
it.
not as much. Maybe not as much.
Yeah, so listen to the experts, bro. Trust the experts.
Sure. Trust the science.
Yeah, trust the science of human action. Anyway, so if we're just going to go by my definition of aggression, which instances of aggression would you think should happen? Like, i.e., which instances of conflict do you think the conflict initiator ought win it?
Wherein there has been a situation where someone has occupied and used a specific area or a specific property for an extensive period of time, or wherein this relationship has occurred and a specific hold on, how do I say this? This relationship occurs and there is a specific exchange of value between the parties involved, I'd say. Right, so rent and wage labor, basically, because I'm a cringe leftoid.
Okay, so you said someone has occupied a specific area for an extensive period of time. How extensive?
Well, let's say that they're on that area for like more than like 2 weeks. Let's say that.
All right, why 2 weeks?
Because I think that that's a reasonable ground. I feel like if you're having a bunch of people on your property for like over 2 weeks and you're sort of like still owning and controlling that property, it's a little bit suspect from my point of view, because you're probably almost necessarily not also on there, and maybe I should have given that as a condition. Of course, I've written down conditions for these types of things, and I'm just kind of like spitballing here, but I've actually written down the specific conditions for property that I support and that I don't support. Right.
Yeah. What about the squatter? Like, I like go out of my house on holiday for 2 weeks. I come back, and it turns out the instant I left my front door, some jackass fucking kicked it down and started just hanging out in my living room for 2 weeks. Does he now own my house?
I think he owns your house if you also own more than one house. I'll say that.
Why does it matter whether I own more than one house? What if I, the week before I went, what if the week before I went on holiday, I was out in the woods with my kids and we built like a tiny little shack, like one of those little lean-tos that you build as a kid, so I do have a different house I could go to. He now owns my like nice human house, and I have to go crawl on this hovel in the ground. Is that fair?
I think the house would have to be comparable to the first house.
Well, how do you define comparable?
It's got to have roughly equivalent attributes and properties.
This is all very, very vague.
No, I mean, it's not that vague altogether. I mean, similarity is something that's very simply understood.
I mean, in any case, like, your justification.
By the way, I want to say this is not actually my property ethic. I'm kind of just spitballing here, right? I've actually written down what like would qualify as valid and invalid property in my view, and it's actually specifically deals with this area of grayness, and it doesn't have that, right? So I understand that I'm just spitballing and I've given you this vague outline here, and there are problems with it, yes, right, but it's not necessarily reflective of some deeper problem of my view. I'm just trying to express that I don't necessarily agree with the lines that you have drawn, and the lines that I have drawn are more in line with occupation, are more in line with use than the lines that you have drawn.
Well, we could go, back to the root then. I assume you've got you've really studied the root of this ethic. So on that area for like more than 2 weeks, right? And the other person's out of there. Your justification for this was it feels like reasonable ground, but I mean, doesn't really feel like reasonable ground to me. Can you like prove that like objectively or something?
Well, I think that it is like from a moral point of view, better to have ownership related closer to occupation and use, because if people are occupying and using things that are controlled and owned by another, then their wills are going to be suppressed in a very deep and personal way, in a very complete way. Right. And I think that since I value, as I've probably told you before, I don't know if it was the first or second time we talked, but I value actualization of subjective will preferences, maximization of actualization of subjective will preferences. Right. And so given this fact, I think that we should oppose those things. Right. And we should look at property as and critically examine it to see if we can't have a system that is more in line with maximizing will actualization.
Well, I mean, the NAP, or at least the property system based upon the NAP, is entirely based on use. But use is not the same thing as possession. I'm currently using my penis, but if some harlot breaks down the door and starts jacking me off, I still own my penis even though she's in possession of it. This happens to me all the time, by the way. But that's the thing. I'm still, I was making the initial use of that. I'm the initial possessor of it, and I'm still using it. It's still within the purview of my action, right? This is why praxeology is so important for anarchist theory, because all these anarchists, they're talking about use this, use that. But really, the only way you can understand use properly is through action. Right? You have to say, right, okay, well, what is proper action? What is improper action? If we care about, use, or rather initial use as opposed to mere possession, well, we come to the conclusion that, right, it's going to be the latecomers who are bad, right? So we have anti-conflict, we have non-aggression.
Yeah, I guess with your example of you getting your dick sucked or getting a blowjob or whatever, I think that you're not really not using or occupying your penis. Like, yes, someone else is also using and occupying your penis, maybe we could say, but
we could say there's a conflict over my penis, right?
You.
We could say there's a conflict over the use of my penis there, couldn't we? If we wanted to be real precise about what we mean.
It might be.
Yeah. So it's the problem there is that there's a conflict over the use of my penis, and I got to it first, right? I'm the owner. That's the problem there. That's why these harlots, they're always raping me.
Yeah. No, I get what you're saying. And I certainly can see the concern, right? Because if I'm saying that actually, initial possessor doesn't matter at all, or that, occupier or user is the only thing that matters, then that might lead me to, have some clearly absurd positions. I can see that, but I don't actually take that in and of itself as an end in and of itself, right? If you noticed, I preface that with my actual moral view, the thing that I do see as an end in and of itself, which is the maximization of subjective will actualization. So insofar as a property ethic would allow people to get raped or allowed all of these things that clearly are a detriment to will actualization, maximization, it would be wrong, right? And it's only like a rule of thumb to consider occupation and use, right?
So you want to maximize, I'm just trying to break this down. So we're maximizing the actualization of subjective will. Let's attack the first part. What does it mean to actualize your subjective will?
Well, every person can be assumed have a set of desires, a set of actions which they desire to take, and a set of actions which they do not desire to take. And we can simplify this further down into just actions which they desire to take by adding negations as desires, right? So you desire not this versus you desire this. And given that we have this, the maximization of that would be, or the actualization of that would be just acting out of some preference, right? Of that set of preferences, of the set of things that you prefer. If that makes sense.
All right, so you're maximizing acting in the way that you want to act.
Yeah, so what I mean by that is
that's not
acting.
an ethic.
Well, how is it not an ethic?
Literally everybody, necessarily, so long as, like, you know, they're not knocked out or something, right? Everybody who is currently acting, they necessarily are acting in the exact way that they want to act. So I don't know how on earth you can...
I know you don't agree with that. Because you
well, I do agree with that. That's very basic praxeology.
The state imposes itself.
Okay, yeah. I see. Yeah, so I was thinking unhampered market. You're right. So we want to, you know, right? So we want to have everybody acting in the way they want to act, so long as they're not interfering with others then?
Yeah, in a sense, and it would be, my threshold for that would be, that's one of the negations, right? It's
so right, yes. So we can't have contradictory actions, right? Where one person's action is mutually exclusive with the action of another.
Yeah,
we gotta throw that
one threshold. Yeah.
You know, I actually have a cool word for contradictory actions. This is a cool little term. Actually, it's all sorts of my friends use it. It's called conflict. And so the way we define conflict,
what you mean by conflict.
It is actually what I mean by conflict. Conflict is contradictory action. This is the definition of conflict.
That's one aspect of it.
It's not one aspect of it. It's the entire definition. I can show you the paper which I'm currently working off of, which is where basically my current property conception comes from. It's the conflict avoidance theory of property by Chris Bohrer, where basically we say that we have property rights over given actions as opposed to actual physical things in the real world. So it's abstracting away from, physics into pure praxeology. So the problem, the way you define conflict in this theory is as contradictory actions. It's actions which are mutually exclusive. So, right, yeah, if that's a problem, if we want to maximize actions which aren't contradictory, i.e. that's the NAP. We're back at the NAP again.
Well, I said that's one threshold. Like, so for example, if
you have a contradictory threshold, then these two thresholds are going to contradict. So you have an incoherent theory. So let's just stick with this one, how about? And then we've got ancap, and it's all consistent and everything.
I think I might be being misunderstood a little bit. And to clarify, my understanding of, because you had expressed this to me before, you had said that conflict is the use of scarce means to ends contrary to that of the initial possessor, right? That was
actually, yeah, that is basically contradictory action. That is just another way of saying contradictory actions.
Yeah, but I don't.
It's a little more wordy, right?
Yeah, that's not necessarily what I would classify as something that contradicts my ethics. So like, yes, it's possible.
We can go back to the base, how we derived this. It was, we want to maximize acting in ways that you want to act, but in order to do this, we have to disallow actions which are mutually exclusive with other actions, right? But if we break down action into its individual components, the only thing which could really be mutually exclusive, right, is going to be the means that you're using. If you're using the same means towards contradictory ends. That was my earlier formulation of it, but, contradictory action is just far easier to say. It's far broader and more abstract, which is why I like it.
Yeah, I mean, that if we're just going with an understanding of reducing contradictory wills, like, so actions which necessitate non-actions and stuff like that. So for example, in my view, like, a given act X is instantiated in society by an actor, and the fact that that X is acted, its negation, not X, has been precluded. And insofar as everyone in that society actually wills for not X, then that would be something that is irrelevant, right? That's all I'm expressing, right? So you can't have the instantiation of a world with X and a world with not X. It's the law of non-contradiction.
Maybe this is going to be the paper which flips you, because he discusses this very much. Like, you can have harmonious actions, if you got a tree and there are two branches which you could swing off of. You could have two people swinging on these branches and they're not interfering with each other, and this is all fine. But that would exclude anybody from coming down and cutting down the tree, because that's going to contradict what they're swinging.
Absolutely. I totally understand the what you're getting across with that. I'm actually very interested in this paper now.
You've been a closet ancap this whole time. You didn't even know it.
Yeah, I must have been.
I must have rubbed off on you, eh?
Maybe.
Like those fucking harlots from earlier.
I know.
Can't stand them.
Yeah. Happens to me all the time as well. But yeah, I'll take a look at that. There might still be some possibility that we're misunderstanding each other, but I've expressed my ethical view.
It's got to be that we're misunderstanding each other if you accept this and then are still in favor of democracy and welfare state and shit like this.
Yeah, I just think that the negation of a welfare state and the negation of a democracy is going to bring about the non-actualization of wills. It's going to lessen the actualization of wills.
Right, but the non-actualization of wills, if we are being precise, that is preventing someone, by, somebody's trying to actualize their will, they're already going ahead and doing it, and then you come in and fuck with them. Right, that's conflict, that's aggression. But welfare and democracy both imply aggression. They both imply the non-actualization of wills, as you'd put it.
I understand, right? Like, and it's not gonna... Yeah, I could even see arguments against the state and against democracy and against welfare policies from even my anti-capitalist perspective. Even back when I was a mutualist, for many, many years for this very reason. Like, it would just seem to be on its face irrational to say we should have any, imposition, any sort of, broad societal coercion. But I just think that the mutualist or ANCAP society will bring about even more repression, even more restriction of will actualization. As much
right.
Like
this is there isn't the ANCAP society. The ANCAP society would be no aggression. That's what we want, right? There isn't like, hey, ANCAPs here. We want some firms like this. 20% of firms and 80% co-ops, and we want every fifth firm to be ran by a woman and every 12th co-op to be ran by a woman. This is what we ANCAPs want. We're not saying anything like that. All we're saying is, hey, aggression is a bad thing. It should always be opposed. There is never a good aggression, ever.
If Okay, so if I'm understanding what you're saying correctly, and I understand the simplified version of the avoidance of conflict that you expressed earlier correctly, then I'm in agreement with it. The only place where we're going to disagree is in application, empirics, and how that's going to look in the real world. And I think that's relevant to me because I do concern myself with the maximization of subjective will actualization. And insofar as I think I am rationally justified in an inference that advocating some sort of doing something or lack of doing something will bring about a reduction in subjective will actualization, I'm going to have to oppose it, right?
Well, what's the
But
alternative,
insofar,
right? Are we going to advocate something which is immoral? Surely not. That's a contradiction. You should never advocate something which you don't want to happen. So we should only advocate for moral things, and we know that aggression is always immoral, so we should never advocate aggression.
well, that's actually not true. Maybe this is a disagreement. Because I believe in the maximization of subjective will actualization and not the total elimination of conflict or contradicting or overlapping and negating wills. I'm going to be able to like settle for some state that has some transgression, some aggression, right? Maybe that's
that's I didn't recognize this because it's been a while since I've interacted with this, but I have actually. I can't remember what I called you people. I think it was like aggression, utilitarian, something like that. You know, some sort of utilitarian where it's like, well, this small aggression, we should do it because it'll stop all these bigger aggressions, right? Is that basically your opinion? Like, you know, yeah,
no.
it's aggression to punch this guy in the face, but it'll stop those three guys from getting punched in the face.
Yeah, that is going to be my view.
Okay, right. I see. So, I mean, the only way we're gonna be able to move forward from here is gonna be argumentation ethics. Unfortunately, it's gonna be our third.
Yeah, and then we're back to that.
It's gonna be our fucking third debate. This always happens. Oh well. Right. So, it is incoherent for any person to ever advocate an aggressive act. It is incoherent to do so. And let me actually get out my flow from yesterday because I debated Mage on this.
I mean, I've done a lot of thinking on this ever since the last time we've talked about this.
And now you agree.
No, I still disagree.
Cringe.
I know.
Let's give pasta flow. Alright, I mean, what part of argumentation ethics do you disagree with? Do you disagree with, like, the root of it, like, the argument from argument itself, where, like, hey, it's incoherent to argue against a normative presupposition of argumentation? Do you disagree with that?
Well, I don't think that it's a contradiction in the relevant sense that it's a contradiction. I can certainly see a sense in which it derives a contradiction, but that sense is not relevant because I can simply say I'm not arguing in that sense.
But if you're not arguing, then your proposition is just a fart in the wind. It's not really to be taken seriously because you're not trying to justify it. It'd be like if I said blah 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 shit in my bum right now. Like you're not going to take that seriously as an argument. And similarly, if I said, hey, aggression is good, and it's like, okay, can you justify that though? And it's like, no, I can't justify it. I'm not going to argue with you. I'm just going to run away. Right?
Yeah, but that's
you wouldn't take me
not what I'm
seriously
saying right now, right? Like, so it's irrelevant because the only sense in which there would be a contradiction is in the relevant sense, where you say I need to justify an act that I'm engaging in, right? So I'm engaging in the act, and you're like, justify why you're doing that. Now,
Ooh.
understanding the definition of conflict and the definition of argumentation that you're working with here, obviously it would be a contradiction for me to justify the action while I'm doing the action, because the action is an action full of conflict. It's an action which engages in conflict, and argumentation lacks that attribute, right? So that would clearly be a contradiction. But I can just simply, in that case, concede and say, I'm not arguing, I'm just acting. But we're
Right,
not
yeah.
doing that now, right? I'm not acting now. You're not acting against me. I'm not acting against you, right? So we
Right,
can
so yeah,
clearly argue.
it's possible indeed to aggress, but the point is that you're right. You would be incapable, completely incapable, of justifying your conduct there without falling into contradiction. That is argumentation ethics. It's that
It's also
aggression is
irrelevant.
unjustifiable.
Yeah, but that's, first of all, I mean, I have two problems. First of all, it's irrelevant because I'm acting, right? I'm not in a state where I'm choosing to argue. I'm
Are you
choosing
not
to
arguing
act.
right now?
Yes, now I'm choosing to argue.
Right,
Right.
so right now you can't justify aggression.
Well, I can.
Go on.
That's not implied by anything that I've conceded to,
Well, no,
right?
because
I can't justify. No,
if you try
this
to
is important.
justify aggression, you're justifying it during an argument, but the argument is already presupposing non-aggression.
No. I can't aggress while justifying the aggression. I can justify the aggression, okay, but I can't do the aggression while I'm justifying, because that would be a contradiction, because in order to justify it, I would need to argue, and arguing is without aggression, right? This is my first problem. It's not relevant.
But how could you justify an aggression, right? Because whenever you're going to be
I'm
aggressing,
not.
it would be impossible to justify it.
Yeah, but I'm not always aggressing.
Okay. So how does this mean that you can say, right, okay, here, let's peacefully sit down and have a nice, peaceful chat. Right, here are the reasons why we should not resolve disputes through nice, peaceful chats.
Okay, so
How can you do that?
let's say that I lay out an argument. Let's say, you're like, hey, someone's talking about, an act which is aggression. They're saying that it's justified. Do you think it's justified? And I say, yes, I do think it's justified. And I lay out some premises. You agree with all the premises, and a necessary conclusion from those premises is the act which justifies aggression, or not the justification, but the act, like the act ought to be done, something like that. Now, you and I have just engaged in an argument, an act which is free from aggression, and I have walked you through a process which has led you to agree with a justification, a logical deduction, which concludes, therefore, you ought to aggress. But no one has aggressed, and insofar as no one has aggressed, the fact that we are arguing has not been contradicted, because arguing is an act without aggression. Now, down the road, you see something happening and we aggress. We couldn't justify it when we were acting, but we justified it to ourselves when we were engaged in the act of argumentation via deduction.
Right, but then you still have the contradiction. If you had walked me down those steps and I'd gone, yeah, I guess it is, it would be a lot like you saying, well, it would be possible for us to meet up and say, right, okay, Zulu, here are the reasons why nobody should ever argue. And you walk me down the steps and I'm like, yeah, I guess I agree, nobody should ever argue. Right? It's contradicted by it, right? Because you clearly think that you should argue.
Yeah, okay. That might be a contradiction because it's to do with actually arguing.
Right, so is aggression.
We're arguing that you shouldn't argue, right?
Yeah.
So I'm the one who's actually walking you through is in contradiction because they're doing the thing they think they shouldn't.
Yeah.
You should do. But that's also entirely irrelevant to the example with argumentation ethics, because what's in question is not arguing or not arguing, it is conflict or non-conflict.
an argumentation is necessarily a peaceful way to resolve disputes. You're presupposing that, hey, the way we should go about resolving disputes that we have is by peacefully trying to convince the other person through the force of our argument, not by beating them. That is what argumentation is. So saying, hey, these are the reasons why you should not trust reason, and instead you should just beat them, right? You're in contradiction. These are reasons why you should not take reason seriously. It's insane.
No, because okay, well, not all acts of aggression. How do I want to say this?
I actually do need to go to
act-
the toilet, so could you just hold that thought?
Sure.
All right, I'll be back in a second. Yellow.
Hey.
All right. Sorry for cutting you off there, but what was your argument that you're going to go into?
I guess my confusion is just that the point of argumentation ethics seems to be that I cannot justify an act, which is an act full of conflict, while I'm engaging in it, right? Because engaging in the act, because it has the attribute of being full of conflict, it will be contradictory with the act of arguing, which is an act free of conflict, right? So that's the contradiction. The contradiction is not that at one point in time I have argued, and at another point in time I am engaging in conflict. Arguing for conflict in one instance is not arguing for conflict in all instances. I mean, this is what we argued about the first time, and I think you see what I mean there. You're very eager to concede and explain that actually it's when you're actually acting, right?
Well, it's
so given that
rather it's when you're capable of arguing. That's when argumentation ethics applies. When you have the potential to argue, that's when argumentation ethics applies to you. Because when you have the potential to argue, you couldn't possibly coherently justify an aggression. It's not you're not capable of it.
So you're saying in any instance when I have the possibility of arguing, I can't justify aggression?
Mm-hmm.
That's what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, how is that concluded from argumentation ethics? Because the contradiction I'm conceding to only deals with when you're actually acting, when you're aggressing.
But it's not just when you're physically aggressing, right? Right now, I couldn't justify, raping someone down the road. I couldn't do it. I physically could do it, right? But I would be contradicting myself because I'm saying, right, here are, when you are engaged in an argument, what that is it is the means of peaceful dispute resolution. So two people, they have some dispute, They disagree over how things should be done, but they're saying, right, we agree that we disagree about this, so let's try and work it out. Let's try and convince each other by demonstrating that we are correct, that it should be done this way. And this is how we're going to resolve this dispute. We're going to come to some sort of an agreement based on a propositional exchange. We're going to be peaceful about it, rather than we have this dispute, and I'm just going to fucking beat you to death for it, right? I don't care, I'm just going to start beating you and aggressing against you until you agree to let me win this dispute about how things should be done. Those are clearly two very different things. So sitting down and saying, right, I'm just going to be nice and peaceful and, nice and calm, and these are the reasons why you should not indeed be nice and peaceful and nice and calm. It's a contradiction.
That's a contradiction.
Yeah.
I'll concede to you about that. What you just told to me is a performative contradiction.
Mm-hmm. But that's argumentation ethics.
Okay, but that's not relevant to arguing conditional aggression, right? Because conditional aggression is conditional, it must be contradictory in the act, and then it would only be contradictory in the act, right? Because the condition would be met only then.
Even conditional aggression, it's impossible to justify without contradiction, because when you're still saying, right, let's peacefully resolve this dispute we have, and here's why you should violently resolve some sort of dispute. Right, when you have a dispute, go ahead and violently resolve it for all I care. No, don't violently resolve it.
That's not an accurate representation of a conditional action. Right, so a conditional act of aggression would be engage in X given Y, right? Y is not the case. Not Y is the case. So we are free to not engage in X, the transgressive act.
And
right?
can you imagine that? I think it was Y was the variable. So can you imagine that? Hey, given Y, we should aggress. Given it's Sunday, we should aggress. Can you imagine if Sunday rolls around, and you were to try and say, right, let's go ahead and aggress. Could you justify it?
No, because I'm aggressing.
Right, yeah, so you couldn't justify it. If the condition was met, right, you are incapable of justifying it.
That's what I said. This is the entirety.
Right, so it's incoherent to justify aggression.
No, because the condition is not met right now.
Okay, yeah, right now it's not met. But right now I'm telling you, right, okay, let's imagine
we meet this condition.
Let's imagine we meet this condition. Suddenly, you can't justify it.
Then I'm not arguing, okay?
Yeah, and you're not. So then your proposition is just a fart in the wind.
It's not a contradiction then.
It is a contradiction.
Not a fart in the
wind. It's
instantiated. It's actually instantiated. Because when I'm acting, I can't be arguing because I'm actually instantiating the agreed upon action. The conditions have been met. I'm actually doing it. So there's nothing profound being stated here. It's not like this defeats arguing about conditional aggression. We can certainly argue about conditional aggression. We just can't argue about it when we're doing it.
Right.
It's completely trivial.
It's not trivial because we're currently having a propositional exchange over some conditional aggression, right? We're currently doing that, and I'm saying, right, no, your aggression, it still implies it's still unjust because you wouldn't be able to justify it. It still would imply contradiction to propose that it's just, right? If you were to try and do that and propose that it was just, you'd contradict yourself, and we know contradictions are falsehood, so it's still a contradiction. You're still proposing a contradiction.
Even if I was acting, even if I was transgressing against you as we speak right now, there wouldn't be a contradiction, right? I just wouldn't be arguing.
Yeah, so you wouldn't be justifying your conduct, and you couldn't justify your conduct. At
I
least not
can't
consistently.
justify it while I'm doing it because of the way that you've defined arguing. And I concede that based on my understanding of the laws of logic and everything. Right? But it's entirely moot because the conditions have not been met. So I'm free to justify it. It's entirely possible. What you're saying now is you're just saying, I'm going to disagree with it. And that's fine. That's your view.
I'm not just
Okay.
saying I'm going to disagree with it. I'm saying it's unjustifiable.
Yeah, because you're going to disagree with it. It is justifiable. No, it is.
I'm going to
show you
disagree
how
with
it's justifiable. It's entirely justifiable. If I'm arguing with someone and I lay out a series of premises, which they deduce that you ought, given some condition, engage in an aggressive act, that can serve as a justification for some person. And it's justified via deduction, via what they already agree with. Right? So everyone would say that's a justification. And it's justifying an act of aggression. It can't be justified while it's being done because that's a contradiction in terms. Okay.
Let's say I were to propose right now, starting in 5 seconds, nobody should ever argue. You know, the time ticks down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then boom. Then I'm just like zip-lipped. Right? Would you be taking me seriously there? And then you say, well, I don't think you're correct that nobody should argue. And I'm just like,
I would if you deduce that from premises that I agreed with.
How would you?
I absolutely would.
That you agreed with, or that I had proven to be the case.
Well, proven to be the case. Like if you deduce them from true premises, then I would agree. I would actually take that very seriously.
Right, a true premise would be something like, well, we can't contradict ourselves, so something which is contradictory, we're gonna have to take the negation.
This is a very common thing. Like, imagine if we said, after, when the clock strikes 12, let's all be silent for 10 minutes. Okay. Well, in that 10 minutes, we can't justify being silent. Right? Does that mean that we get to talk? Clearly, that doesn't act as a proof that we can speak during that 10 minutes. Maybe there's like some active shooter outside, and we need to be quiet, and there's good reason to be quiet for 10 minutes.
You can indeed justify that you should be silent for 10 minutes if speaking would imply violation of property rights, i.e. it would imply that you're aggressing, right? Because argumentation ethics is not saying, right, you should always be arguing. It's saying, right, there are certain situations when you should argue, namely when you have some sort of a dispute. That's when you should argue. You should argue over that dispute to try and resolve it.
Yeah, well, that's very similar to what I'm saying. I'm saying sometimes it's okay to argue, sometimes it's okay.
Yeah, you're right, but it's not similar, because I'm saying when you have a dispute over how things should be done, you should argue of that dispute instead of beating them. You're saying, well, you should argue when it's Tuesday, but not when it's Sunday. Then you should just start fucking beating people.
Yeah, okay, that's your characterization of what I'm saying. But you're also saying that there's a contradiction in that. I'm wanting you to derive the contradiction, not the contradiction that I've already agreed with, but the contradiction that you're espousing, because you're clearly still saying that there's some deeper contradiction here. I want you to derive that.
I already have derived it. I've demonstrated that, hey, whenever you would think to aggress, you couldn't possibly justify this aggression. Because if you try to justify it, you'd contradict yourself. So we know that aggression must be unjust. Whereas, if I were to go ahead and, do something like eating an apple, I could indeed justify eating that apple, because argumentation doesn't imply not eating an apple. I could eat an apple whilst arguing, but I can't peacefully resolve disputes whilst non-peacefully resolving disputes. Those contradict each other.
Thoughts are involved?
What?
Now there's thinking involved. Now we're dealing with...
When the fuck did I bring thinking in? I mean,
You
thinking
said
is
that
involved.
earlier,
What? What are you talking
right?
about?
If we can justify things through thought and not argumentation,
What?
then I can
When
justify
did I say this?
you said that you can't justify it through thinking or something like that.
What?
You can't.
No, I
Okay,
didn't.
maybe you didn't say that. I don't know.
I said you.
That's what
I said at some point in time I want to eat an apple, and you say, hey, justify to me that you're allowed to eat the apple. I'd be able to justify to you that I'm allowed to eat this apple, all the while arguing with you, because eating an apple doesn't contradict any normative presupposition of argumentation, whereas aggression, i.e. violent dispute resolution, does indeed contradict non-violent dispute resolution.
Oh, hold on. I don't think you can argue while eating an apple.
Oh, I've done it before. Right now I'm arguing whilst drinking beer.
Well, if you're actually taking a sip, you can't argue.
I could be typing. We could have an argument whilst typing.
Well, you get what I'm saying, right? Like there could be an action that you're doing that, you can't actually respond to someone asking for a justification.
Do you have an example?
But nonetheless, okay, so let's say it's like you're controlling like a mecha bot or something, right? And you're just strolling around in your mecha bot, but to actually control the mecha bot and make sure it doesn't fall over, you have to like constantly hold all the different things, and there's some type of like there's something in your mouth, like you're really trying to like also carry this like document to your friend's house or whatever, and you have to hold it in your mouth because you need all your limbs to control the different arms of this mecha bot, right? And someone comes along and says, oh, why are you going down this road in this mecha bot? Why are you walking around this mecha bot? The mecha bot's not hurting anyone. It's just there walking around respecting traffic and whatnot. You can't justify, right, you engaging in that specific set of actions while you're doing it, because to do so would negate engaging in those actions. Either the mecha bot would fall over, or the paper for your friend would fall onto the ground and be scattered and destroyed and whatnot. You see what I'm saying?
Well, I don't know about you, but my mecha bot has a nice Neuralink link up, and I always make sure to plug in my Neuralink before I go out. And then I use the inboard speakers, and it, I can control the speakers with my mind's eye or whatever, right? And I say, hey, buddy, get the fuck out of my way, this is my road.
Yeah, okay.
It sounds like you've got a El Cheapo mecha bot.
Yeah, I do have a pretty shitty mecha bot, but that's not a crime. Do you think it should be?
No.
Hey, why? I can't justify why I get to own it.
Yeah, you could.
I could after I get out.
And somebody tries to stop you, they wouldn't be able to justify it. They wouldn't be able to justify stopping you.
Yeah, that's a good point, but I couldn't ask for justification.
Okay.
I mean, you see, this is, that's my first problem. My first problem is it's not relevant because it's only true.
Oh, it is relevant. The person wouldn't be able to justify preventing your mecha bot from going forward. So you're allowed to just fucking go ahead. If someone can't justify stopping you, then it would be aggression to stop you. It would be unjust. That's literally what it means. Unjust.
I can't justify having the mecha bot.
You can't justify having it.
How? I can't speak while I'm doing it.
I mean, you could justify the action of it moving down the road, right? You could justify that. And more importantly, other people couldn't justify stopping you from doing it. And the presumption is on innocence, right? If nobody else can justify preventing you, then you're good to go. Right?
I don't think that you're engaging with the spirit of what I'm saying, right? Like
I think I am. Like, I might be really engrossed in something and I'm not paying attention to anything else. And, I might not be aware of anything. And I wouldn't think to go, by the way, any snipers around, don't shoot me. Right? I don't do that like every 15 minutes. But still, a sniper on the hill, they wouldn't be able to justify shooting me. It's the onus on the person who wants to go ahead and do the thing to go ahead and justify it. It's the person who wants to interfere with the person, who wants to justify their conduct. They have to justify why that person is guilty and they're committing a crime in that conduct. If they don't do that, if they can't demonstrate this, then dittos, right? Get out of here.
I have conceded as far as I can allow myself to. I have conceded the areas where I see a contradiction. I have tried to make you aware of the areas where I don't see a contradiction, and I still have yet to see a reason for those areas that are free of a contradiction actually being full of a contradiction. It seems absolutely clear to me, as I demonstrated before, that someone can hold a position that if you gave the example of we should never argue in like 10 minutes, right, or something like that. After 10 minutes, we should never argue. I think if you deduce that or derive that from premises that are, sound, then I should, agree with that. That's an entirely cogent thought process. There's nothing contradictory to it at all, because the condition has not been met yet, right? X is not true, or Y is not true. So given that there's not Y, then we don't have to fulfill X, and X is contradictory to our current actions, but we're not in, Y is not true, so we don't have to engage in X.
But like, the point is that argumentation itself is indeed presupposing that we're going to be resolving disputes peacefully. Right? You can add conditions all you want, but it doesn't change that. Argumentation is categorically peaceful dispute resolution.
You can load the term in a way to make that work. You can say that in arguing, I necessarily agree to always argue. And
well,
if I don't agree with that, then I can't ever argue.
That's not the case. In arguing, arguing, you're presupposing that the way to resolve disputes is peacefully. That is my claim.
Yeah, that's not clear at all.
I've said it multiple times.
I mean, in any case, it's not clear that is what arguing entails at all.
I mean,
it seems like utterly extraneous thing that you're attaching to arguing.
I mean,
on Monday I can argue with someone, and then on the next day I can kill them. It's entirely logical.
The conclusions have to be universal. Like, it would be forever impossible for you to argue in favor of violent dispute resolution. So it's very much categorical.
Yeah, arguing does not hold that meaning for me.
I mean, this is what all the texts are.
It's an utterly extraneous factor to the act of arguing, is that you necessarily, nothing about me arguing means that I'm not going to aggress.
It means that you can't aggress whilst you're arguing, and you couldn't justify that aggression, therefore.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. Okay. But me arguing does not mean that I cannot, at some other point in time, aggress.
I agree. It doesn't mean that you are physically bound to non-aggression.
So
right?
you
But
agree.
if you were to aggress, then we know that trying to justify your aggression there would be a contradiction.
Yes.
Yeah. And contradictions are falsehoods.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but it's certainly.
Well, there it is. Finally, it takes a while sometimes, but eventually, Everybody who disagrees with argumentation ethics rejects the law of non-contradiction.
Well, I mean, if we're talking about the world, okay, that's a deeper philosophical thing. We're talking about in the world of actual things, of noumena, is there actually an attribute of logic? Is there actually this law of identity out there? I can't know that, right?
Right, yeah, so
but for all intents and
reject the
purposes,
laws of thought, and then...
No, I'm agreeing with you.
I completely agree. If the laws of thought don't hold, then argumentation ethics doesn't hold, but
you were
nothing
waiting
holds.
for me to say that. But okay, that's an entirely extraneous position that I have. Okay, I practically agree with all the laws of logic. Okay,
Yeah,
so
practically I agree rape is bad, but you know,
no, that's not what I'm meaning to say. Okay, it's wrong. Paradoxical things are to be avoided.
Are to be avoided. No, it's paradoxical things are impossible. They're wrong. They're false.
Well, if they're impossible, then no one could argue against anything that you agree with.
No, that's not a paradox, right? They're not literally in contradiction. It's simply their ethic is contradictory, right? There's a difference there. They're not physically, you know, running and crawling at the same time. They are in normative contradiction. Their proposal is a contradiction. Like if I say this ball is both blue all over and red all over, it doesn't make it that the ball is suddenly blue all over and red all over. There's not a physical contradiction involved. There's a logical contradiction.
Okay, conceptual paradoxes certainly can exist conceptually. But we're not talking about a conceptual paradox. We're talking about an actual performed paradox, a performative paradox.
Right. Well, this is, you know, I think you're being confused by the word performative here. It's not that you are literally engaged in a paradoxical action. It's that your action is in contradiction to what you claim to be true. Right? You're not actually contradicting what you're doing there. You are saying something and doing a contradictory thing to that thing. So we know not to trust what you're saying. So this is... Maybe we can use the word dialectic contradiction here. It might be a little more clear what I mean.
I see what you're saying. Like it's the liar's paradox. You know, everything I say is a lie. Well, is that a lie? You know, I see what you're saying. But you know, all that being said, I'm agreeing with you that paradoxes should be avoided. I'm agreeing with you that it will be bad if I'm actually engaging in some type of performative paradox. Okay. In fact, in my argument against you, I mentioned that things were paradoxical, and I used that as reasoning for why I don't hold a position. Right. So, you know, I'm clearly saying that I don't like paradoxes.
Yeah. So no time travel. That's off the.
No time travel unless it's on a Mobius strip, then it's solved.
Yeah.
But I guess I don't see the paradox in the way that you're saying it. I've conceded to where the contradiction is, right? But that's irrelevant because then I can just say I'm not arguing, I'm acting, right? Then obviously.
But then you're not justifying it.
Yeah, then I'm not justifying it, but so I can justify it now.
So the justification would be just a fart in the wind, right? It would be incoherent.
No, because...
if I'm saying, hey, I want to go ahead and murder you, bitch, and she's, you know, well, yeah, I go up to one of my hoes and I say, I want to murder you, bitch, and she says, I think that's incorrect.
If it sound premises, then it's justified. Yes, no?
But it's not going to come from sound premises, is my point. Because we could do this future-looking analysis, right? We could do this analysis. We're doing it right now.
It's so utterly absurd. Okay, you've conceded to me saying that the paradox, the contradiction, is in one isolated segment, right? Mm-hmm. If it's conditional, then it is only paradoxical if we're trying to justify, we're trying to argue during the act. Okay,
so we're doing this future-looking... But we're doing this future-looking analysis when we say, right, You're claiming that it would indeed be just for you to kill that person on Friday. You want to do a drive-by shooting. You want to drive by the Blicky boys on Friday. You want to kill them all on Friday. And it's not Friday yet. So let's think this through. Let's imagine that you did try to justify it on Friday. Well, you'd contradict yourself. We know contradictions are falsehoods, so it's not the case that it would be fine to drive by the Blicky boys on Friday.
What makes it a contradiction? What was in the story? What made it a contradiction?
If you were to try to justify it on Friday, we know that you would contradict yourself. So we know that it would be unjust at the actual time when you want to do it. Whenever that time you want to do it actually
no,
is.
Because
you would contradict yourself in the justification.
An earlier date. It merely cannot be justified through argumentation at the same time. It can be justified through argumentation at an earlier time.
No. It could not be, because we would just go through this little process. We would say, right, let's look to the future. And what if you tried to say that, yeah, it's just for me to do this? You'd contradict yourself, and we know contradictions are falsehoods. So whenever you want to aggress on someone, it would be contradictory to try and justify that aggression. So we know aggression must always imply falsehood.
If I don't know what to say to get you to see that this is not a meaningful issue. Yes, there's a contradiction there. The contradictions
are falsehoods.
Yes. I can't argue and act at the same time if that
you can't argue and act at the same time.
No, I know. I'm saying if that action is an action full of conflict, okay? I can only act if it's an action free of conflict.
Yep.
If it's an action which is full of conflict, then it is paradoxical with arguing, because arguing is defined as that which is free of conflict. I'm 100% agreeing with that. But I can still argue at an earlier date where the threshold for action is not met. And if I give you a series of premises which are sound, and you agree that they conclude that given some condition, an act of aggression can be done, then they're justified via argumentation. If it's justified, then it's justified all the time.
Yeah. My point...
I can't justify it in argumentation.
Okay.
That's my point.
My point is that at this earlier date, before you go ahead and drive by the Blicky boys, at this date, there does not exist this set of premises where you could prove that it would be justified in the future to drive by the Blicky boys.
Independent of action.
Whoa. Of action. These premises do not exist. This chain of logic does not exist, because we know that if you try to justify it at the time, which is when you're actually going to do it, that's when you would need to justify it, we know that you would contradict yourself, and we know contradictions are falsehoods. So if we suppose that this set of premises did indeed exist, we would have a contradiction in logic. Oh, this is not a valid system of logic.
The truth of what what we're talking about, or what we're arguing about, is going to be true whether or not I can justify it in the moment, because truth is independent of action, right? Unless we're saying that truth is dependent on action, which would be a weird... I mean, we can go down that road if you want to. But given that I have validly deduced from sound premises some conclusion, the fact that I cannot engage in some act during some time does not mean that does not obtain. It still obtains, because its truth value would be independent of the action of me justifying it. I cannot justify it through argumentation, but it is still just in terms of reasoning. It's still just in terms of thought or truth. I just can't engage in an act. I can't speak, There are plenty of acts that are contradictory to each other, right? I can't wave and give you a middle finger at the same time, right? Like, right? Plenty of things are plenty of acts are contradictory, but that doesn't speak at all to the fact of whether or not it is true that I can wave or that it is true that I can give you the middle finger. You just can't do that at the same time.
Well, let's say, right, I validly deduce from sound premises that A does in fact not equal A. Then A doesn't really equal A, right?
If okay, it's hard for me to understand the point that you're making here because I feel like you're not. Again,
Well,
you're not actually.
I have some
Stating
sound
some triviality here.
I have some valid premises, and from these valid premises, I deduce that A does not equal A. Then A doesn't really equal A, does it?
That's just you saying that there's a contradiction.
No. I'm saying I've proven from these valid premises that A doesn't actually equal A anymore.
Okay, you clearly didn't listen to anything that I said.
I did listen.
I'm not saying that you can deduce that a contradiction exists. I'm not sat here saying yes, the
That isn't what I
contradiction,
said.
yes, the contradiction over and over again. I'm specifically saying that the contradiction is one of acts that does not bear on the truth of what I had previously said. Acts are not truth. Acts are not bearing on some other irrelevant truth. Like if we're arguing about something that is not that does not pertain to the act of arguing, right? Then me arguing isn't going to bear on that at all. Me not being able to argue is not going to bear on the truth value of what I've deduced from that.
The point I was making there was that you're saying, right, we have these set of premises. Let's just put that to the side right now. We have some sort of set of premises where they imply something which is clearly false, right? And then that clearly false thing must be true because these premises were valid. We already said they were valid, right? That's the point I'm making. We already know it would be the case that it's not going to be just. The very definition of not just, of unjust, is that you cannot justify it.
It's justified reasoning. I just cannot engage in the act of justifying it. Again, this always comes down to there's some semantic thing that we're not understanding between us. So when you say justify it, I'm thinking, okay, justify it in terms of argue out the premises, right? Clearly, I can't do that with you while I'm engaging in the transgressive act because that's contradictory to arguing, right? I can't do them at the same time, just like I can't wave and flip you off at the same time, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that I can't argue doesn't make the premises the fact the premises lead to the conclusion false. Doesn't make that because valid deduction, truth value, is independent of action.
But it's exactly in argumentation. It's not action in general, right? It's in argumentation when the validity of something is indeed able to be disputed. It's only in argumentation that you can demonstrate the validity of something. So you couldn't demonstrate the validity that nobody should ever argue. It's dialectically false.
I agree with that. I agree.
Right, so we have the base level. Dialectic falsehoods are indeed a thing. If it's not possible, if you are contradicting something which is a normative presupposition of arguing, then that thing has to be false. And this is time invariant, as I've shown, right? Because if at any point when you'd want to aggress, if you try to justify that aggression, you would run into contradiction. So it must always be the case that it's unjust to aggress, whilst you're able to argue. Maybe you become some animal, right? You get a big hit on the head, and you want to go maul a bunch of people because you became a bear, or whatever. Then yeah, argumentation ethics no longer applies to that individual. They can just be fucking hunted or whatever.
I just don't know where to go with this. I mean, I've exhausted all my avenues of trying to explain why this doesn't make any sense. I don't know. I don't know, man. It just seems like everything that I say, you just keep going back to the fact, but it's wrong. But it's wrong. Okay, like I don't. It's not convincing to me. It's
Well,
very clearly.
whether it's convincing to you is kind of irrelevant.
I know. Okay, fine, all right, but obviously you're having the conversation with me, right?
Mhm.
Like that's what I'm saying. It's very frustrating. Like seriously, like
Okay.
it, I'm really trying to. I don't fucking know. Like the condition isn't met, right?
I'm aware.
The condition isn't met,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm arguing now
Mm-hmm.
that when the condition is met, the transgression should be done. Okay.
Yep.
I can. That well, I'm going to say that's valid. You're going to say that's impossible because of the performative contradiction, right? You're going to say it's invalid because of the performative contradiction.
What I'm going to say is that, hey, you're presupposing that such a set of premises where you could demonstrate that in this future point it would be valid, it would be just to aggress against this guy. You're presupposing that these premises exist, but I'm saying no, they couldn't possibly exist. Because in trying to justify it at that point, you would contradict yourself, so it must be unjust at that point to aggress.
Yeah. I agree that I cannot justify the act while I'm doing it. Okay. I'm agreeing with you there.
And the reason you can't justify it is because it's a contradiction.
Yes.
And contradictions are false,
It's
so it's necessarily at that point when you want to aggress, it's necessarily false that it's just. It's necessarily unjust at any point you would want to aggress.
No, because the contradiction is in the act, not in truth. The contradiction.
I mean, do you think? What do you mean?
I cannot justify it because I cannot utter words at the same time that I'm actually doing the thing. I cannot engage in conceptually what we understand as belonging to the category of arguing while I'm doing the thing.
I mean, yeah, you can just go ahead and become an animal, and then you can go ahead and aggress all you want, but it wouldn't, and then you'll just be hunted.
Justify it because it's false. I can't not justify it because it's false.
It is false. It's a contradiction.
It could be true.
It could. No, it couldn't be true. It's a contradiction.
Because no, it's a contradiction. So I can't say anything to you. I can't argue. But the fact that I can't argue it to you does not mean that it's false. Because the contradiction is in the act, not in the truth of what I'm saying.
Right. The contradiction is not just in some random act. The contradiction is in the act of trying to demonstrate its truth. That's when you come into contradiction. If you come into contradiction in the act of trying to demonstrate the truth of something,
then we go back to the
false.
point I made earlier, which is I could have demonstrated that it was true beforehand, which would mean that
it's my point. True. You couldn't have demonstrated its truth beforehand because we could do the exact thing I'm doing right now.
The truth is not in the fact that I'm arguing. The fact that I'm arguing is not that it's true. Like the truth is not dependent on my ability to utter words and articulate things. It's true because it descends from sound premises, or it itself is sound. It itself is a tautology.
Right, but it's not descending from sound premises, is my point. Sound premises do not exist, which would justify aggression.
Yeah, but that's just, at this point, you're in tautology for you're just saying that over and over.
It's not a tautology.
Well, there seems to be no substance behind it, unless you think that arguing or acts are somehow connected to truth, or that the act of actually arguing is like what is the truth, and the truth is not anything outside of the act.
I mean, if you have a proposition, quote air quotes there, some sort of sentence which sounds like it might be a proposition, and you're completely unwilling to justify this, then it's a fart in the wind. Nobody has to take it seriously. Nobody has to take seriously. If I just ran up to you and said, I'm allowed to shit wherever I want, and you're like, really, bro? Can you demonstrate this? And I just ran away screaming. You wouldn't take me seriously. I have to demonstrate it.
We're not getting anywhere through this. We need to cover some other thing first. Do you think that what do you think is the threshold for truth? How do you think we know true things?
I'll go for a priori, right? So we can know something a priori if, if let's say it's a priori true that A is the case. The only way this would be provable a priori is if in trying to deny A, you therefore affirmed A. So something like the law of non-contradiction. If you try to deny it, you'd end up affirming it. Or the action axiom. If you try to deny it, you'd end up affirming it. Or the a priori of argumentation. Trying to deny it, you end up affirming it.
Okay,
this is what makes an axiom.
So let's say take a priori knowledge. That the fact that something a priori is true is the case even apart from whether you engaged in any action.
But it's based on affirmation by denial. It's not just you.
No, I know.
You know about it beforehand.
What I'm saying is not. That's not relevant to what I'm saying. I'm just saying you've come to some knowledge. It's a priori knowledge. That's one set of knowledge. I understand a priori knowledge. And the fact that, let's say A, for example, you gave, the fact that A is true is the case independent of, whatever you did, whatever act you did, whatever utterance you made. No?
But what matters is how do you come to know that A is true? And how you come to know it is by, you have to be able to engage in action to come to know anything. To come to know a single thing, you have to be able to engage in action. And the way we demonstrate A's truth a priori is by saying, right, if you try to deny A, you'd end up affirming it. This is argumentation ethics, right? This is not even unique to Hoppe. This has been around since Aristotle. Affirmation by denial.
Well, I mean, this is kind of similar to Descartes' cogito a little bit, where he thinks what is the last thing that I cannot doubt, right? I cannot doubt itself. I cannot doubt thought itself, because in order to doubt, I must be doubting, right?
Yeah.
But what if he's not doubting? Well, then it could be false that he's doubting, right?
But then he wouldn't be there to doubt. And the point Hoppe makes in his lecture on it is that, well, his proposition, his saying of cogito, that itself is a proposition. So, argumentation must be below that. Really, argumentation is the root of philosophy. That is Hoppe's point.
That's the problem. Yeah, I don't take that view at all. I think that I take instead of starting at argumentation, I start at phenomena. Philosophically, I started.
What do you mean by phenomena? And hold on, actually, I'll take a piss first, unless you don't want to go into a whole fucking thing, and we could end here. Or if you do want to go into a whole thing, I need to take a piss.
You go ahead.
Alright, okay. And this time I'll remember to stop having my BRB screen on after I come back. All right, that's me back.
Hey,
Howdy. So
got
you
the
wanted to go into
difficulty now.
phenom
Oh yeah. So,
phenomena, I think it
so yeah.
was.
For me, phenomenal experience and its character is brute and basic, and it's from that point that I derive identity and I derive, all other forms of knowledge. And the point of relevancy, I think, is that if you're starting from a point of argumentation, I'm actually familiar. I watched some of Hoppe's lectures where he states this, that different people have different starting points, like the Kajito, and like there's someone who had like a linguistic starting point, and
Wittgenstein, I think it was.
Wittgenstein, yeah, and Hoppe says, well, we should start with argumentation. If you take that view, I think everything that you're saying to me would make sense, but I don't see any reason to take that view as opposed to any other. And for me, the problem is that the truth of the premises and the truth of the conclusion are going to be true. They're arrived at independently of utterances, independently of action, and they remain true in spite of action, unless the truth value is attached to the actions, which is why I say, obviously, it's a performative contradiction to, if we set the category as excluding an attribute and that attribute is occurring, then obviously that's a performative contradiction, because that deals with actions, right? But if the truth value does not actually deal with actions, then all I have to do is say that I'm not engaging in this contradictory behavior, and then the contradiction is avoided, right? And on my view, that's perfectly cogent. And on your view, I think that is sort of maybe confusing. And I'm not exactly sure why, but that seems to be the point of difference.
Well, you said there that, well, we arrive at these truths independently of action, but I mean, how on earth could you arrive at anything independently of action? You have to act and you have to be able to make propositions and exchange propositions in order to arrive at truth.
Well, no, you could take in sense data. That's a passive activity, I guess, to say. It's not really an activity. It's just something that happens to you. It's not something that you do to
I mean,
something.
some sort of an amoeba might take in sense data, but we're not concerned about the epistemology of amoeba. We're concerned about the epistemology of humans who are acting.
Yes, we do engage in action, and we do collect some data through action, but action is not necessary to collect data.
But we're always acting when we're collecting these data, right?
Well, you'd say that the collecting of the data is an act. I don't really conceive of collecting data in that way. I think collecting data is just something that happens. We choose actions. We don't choose to collect data or not. It just happens to us.
Well, you could choose to either shut your eyes or keep them open.
Yeah, but you can't. I mean, I guess in an ultimate sense, you could choose to kill yourself, and then you wouldn't feel anything. But I think that lack of feeling, it can still be expressed as a type of feeling, right?
I mean, ultimately, all this sense data is just going to be raw. It's just going to be raw stimulation, unless you can actually reason through what on earth it means. If you're not reasoning through what it means, you're not arriving at truth. You're just arriving at raw stimulation. You're just like an animal. You're just an automaton.
Yeah. I mean, I will be willing to concede that maybe it is the case that there are actions throughout this entire process. Maybe I'm just using a different semantic, set of words to describe this. Sure, I mean, obviously, maybe even taking in sense data is an action in and of itself. But the point of relevancy, I would say, is that fundamentally these actions are not the same types of actions as arguing, right? The key point is that taking in sense data is not the same type of action as expressing premises or engaging in some type of argument, such that I don't have to constantly argue in order to reify truth, right? Like if I see a cloud that looks kind of funny, it looks kind of, you ever see one of those clouds that looks like England? You know,
Yeah, yeah.
everyone always posts them, memes and whatever. If I saw that cloud and then 3 days go past, I don't have, in order for me to affirm a truth value that that cloud exists, you know, does that cloud exist? It does. Is affirming the truth value. I don't have to actually like engage in actions which would rise to the threshold of arguing. All I have to do is, you know, think in my head, I'm recalling this sense data, and it falls into this category of true, and what, and you know, the cloud did look like England, etc., etc., etc. That doesn't rise to the threshold of an actual argument. It's an action. I can concede that's an action, but it's certainly not an argument.
But to demonstrate its truth value, you'd have to formulate some sort of a proposition, and have this proposition up in the air, you know, up for dispute, right? Or else you haven't demonstrated it to be true.
I've certainly demonstrated it to be true because that's my theory of truth.
I mean, I'm not sure we're going to get anywhere because a couple episodes early, I've not quite reached the episode on objectivist epistemology yet on my playlist that I've got going on.
Okay.
I'll let you know after I've finished that playlist though, and we can talk epistemology more.
Sure. But I think that's what I mean. If we want to move further,
if that's the issue, then yeah, I'll have to do some more epistemology.
And this was, mind you, this was all to deal with my first problem with argumentation ethics, not my second problem.
It's always with you that I fucking end up like we get down right to the root, where it's just, well, I think this and I think this.
Yeah. You know, maybe it'll keep going, maybe it'll end someday. Someday we'll find the point of agreement.
Eventually, we're going to like get right down to the core of metaphysics, probably.
Yes. When I might you know, hit you up when I get done writing my book that explains in detail my philosophical positions. That way, maybe we can know. Hopefully, I'll take a look at this PDF you sent me.
It's pretty short. You can like read it in like an hour, easy.
Coolio.
Anyway, thank you for coming on.
No problem. If you ever need someone to talk to, just hit me up.
Well, it'll probably be Doggo who ends up nagging one of us into a debate.
Yeah, that was hilarious. I find it very embarrassing. You know, all the leftoids on that server know that I find it very embarrassing. But I find it very embarrassing that they kick you guys out and all that type of stuff. Like,
yeah, it's like they can't handle it.
Yeah, they don't know what a hypothetical is.
Very embarrassing. So fucking like I agree, that would be very embarrassing if some, because we'll say shit like well, imagine you had this disease where you must rape someone or else you'll die, and they're like, what, so you want to rape people? It's like, no, that's our point. We don't want to rape people.
Yeah, they can't get that. They don't get hypotheticals, and it's like,
this is why I tell you about brainworms. They are brainworms. They don't understand this shit.
Yeah, well, a lot of them are very smart in other areas. Like, you know, one of those guys is an economist. You know, a lot of those guys are really big into reading theory and whatnot, and
like they know how to regurgitate facts. I think, but I don't think they think.
You think I think?
You seem to.
Thank you. I think you think as well.
Thank you.
Sometimes.
By the way, that is the biggest compliment I've ever given a leftist. So, you're welcome.
Yeah. Maybe someday I'll be the one to, you know, bring you to the dark side.
Unless I get you here first.
Yeah, it'll be a competition for that, I guess. But yeah, always good to talk. I think
Yeah.
I'll
It was
I'll
fun,
go sign
and
up.
good luck on your new channel. Send it to me once it's all set up, and I'll link it in the description.
Yeah, I'll make sure to do that. Peace.
Peace. That was a fun one. I mean, you know, I think he was wrong about everything, but we're not gonna get anywhere if we just keep saying fucking "but why" or whatever. So I think it was a good point to end it. And also, I'm running low on beer, so I don't want to keep this going until fucking 3 a.m. It's already late for me, guys. So I will be making a full series on argumentation ethics, natural law, all that jibba jab. So look out for that. It'll be on Skillshare, where I'll have an affiliate link where you can get it for free. And I'll also upload it to my YouTube members only. So you could get it on a Skillshare free trial, or if you're a member, you could just watch it forever. So, you know, make sure to look out for that, and maybe that'll drive some memberships. Anyway, see ya. Boop.